Parenting While Grieving. And today I'm talking with Brooke Shelton, who's the mental health social worker based in Brisbane. So, Brooke, can you start by talking about your practice model as a mental health social worker?
Yeah, I can. Thanks, Ione, and thanks for having me today. In my work, I use the psychodynamic model and an attachment theory to really think about relationships. I work with new parents and people who have lost babies and children, or where there have been losses in the past.
Okay. And how does loss affect parenting in your experience?
I think that's such a huge question, isn't it? I think the paper that comes to mind really is this paper called Ghosts in the Nursery by Selma Frauberg, and really it talks about how we're often haunted by our past and really how past losses really impact parents by changing their perspective. They can really kind of not be clear in the moment and really be kind of impacted on by the past losses. And then I think if you have the current loss, it really just changes your relationship either with future babies or future children or even the children you have. It really just stops you from being able to live in the moment, and it really just impacts on your day-to-day functioning.
Okay, so that sounds so sad and really difficult for parents. Loss is so painful. So what are your thoughts on the impact on parents who've lost a father or mother while and are grieving about that? What's the impact
Yeah.
of their parenting?
I think it's just so difficult, isn't it? I think they need so much time to grieve for themselves, but life goes on with medical appointments, school, shopping, all the day-to-day kind of goings on of a family, and there's just no time to grieve as you normally would be able to. So you have children there taking up the space, so you might push on as though nothing has happened and send the children straight back to school and really kind of go on as if nothing has happened, but really something really significant has happened, and that can really kind of extend or prolong the grieving process because you're not actually giving such an important issue the time that it really needs.
Yeah, that's such a good point that grief does need a lot of time and
Yeah.
space. So, what's your advice for parents who are grieving?
Uh, I think the first thing that comes to mind is really to utilize whatever supports you have to really create a space for yourself to kind of have some time to slow down and process the loss. That so often when life gets busy and you try and be strong for everyone else, you don't find that space. So really to try and slow down and find space in your everyday to actually think about the loss and allow yourself to feel how hard it is. And I think it's also really important with older children to talk about the person that's been lost.
Sure.
Often this is so painful. It can be so hard to actually do that for them, but they're thinking about the loss and you're thinking about the loss. I think it's so important to find that space as well.
Yeah, that's really true. And sometimes I read advice for parents to tell children about how their parent or loved one has died. And with an illness like cancer, that can make sense because there's time to prepare for the death, and there might be
Mm.
medical procedures going on. But with suicide, some modes of death may be too distressing to talk about. And what's your view on that?
I think that's such an important topic, isn't it? And I think for me, it really depends on the age of the child, but really to slow down and think about what the child is really asking from you. Often we as adults think they're needing kind of all the details, but often it's about thinking, what is the child really worried about? Or what are they really wondering from these questions, rather than going talk really about like the practicalities of how they died and the whole story. So they might actually just want to know, was dad in pain, or where is mum now, or some of those kind of ideas of understanding it rather than actually needing all those details. And I think that that's really important to kind of think about what the child needs rather than go into an adult processing kind of space.
Right, that's really good advice to think about. And what about children with developmental delays and disabilities? Do you have any strategies you'd suggest for talking with those children about loss?
Yeah, and I guess every situation can be different, but the first kind of suggestion that really comes to mind is thinking about what the child needs, and it could be making a storybook for them, or photos, or things that they like doing together. So thinking about the person as a whole, not just how they die. And I think that's especially important during when someone has suicided, to think of the person as a whole, the other things that they actually like to do, the things that you might miss about them, the things that you're sad about, including photos of the child with the person they've lost can be really powerful. And it can be just a nice book to kind of go back to. It can also help grandparents or other people to kind of go, let's go and read the book about Dad. And it really keeps that relationship alive as well. And I think that can be really helpful, especially with children with developmental delays, or who aren't always able to talk about how they're feeling.
Yeah. And I guess that's a really good message for the parents as well, that the way that their loved one died doesn't define them as a person. So that's really a beautiful thing to say.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We're
So,
so much bigger than how we die.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So, what are the most important messages for children following bereavement?
I think for me, it's really about safety and stability at home, reminding them that everything will be okay, that you're a safe and stable person for them, that even that something really, really terrible has happened, that there will be life again, there will be hope again, returning to school or kind of activities when they're ready for it. Not to push ahead as if nothing has happened, but also to find that regular rhythm again that reassures children that although there's been something significant, that there is still safety and stability again.
Great. And what are the stress symptoms to look out for?
I think with little kids, I think it's really important to look at if they're saying they're feeling sick, or if they've got a sore tummy, if they're kind of saying things like they don't want to go to school, or they're worried about things. They're all just those things of kind of, they're not as excited as they were about things before, or they're kind of body symptoms, anything that kind of often it can be related to like depression or anxiety or stress, really.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, what do you think parents need to know about children's grief?
Oh, that's a big question, isn't it?
Yeah.
So, really, that some families work their way through the loss and feel really well resourced, and they feel like they're able to cope with it, and that they're prepared to help their children. But you should also know that sometimes it's okay not to know what to do, that grief can change over time, and that there's also a lot of support services out there. I think it's important to kind of think about what you need as a family, and that it's okay to have days where you don't cope and other days when you do feel okay, that it will change over time.
Yeah.
And yeah, so it's really just that kind of grief can kind of go up and down, and you don't always have to have the answers, that there are some support services out there that can help it, and that it's okay to be angry or sad all at the same time.
Sure. Yeah, so one of the services that people in our online groups say is really useful is Camp Magic for children
Mm.
with grief. So, yeah, that
Yeah.
there are services out there. That's right. Yeah, and I guess in Australia, there can be quite a stoicism about death. And
Mm.
people just keep soldiering on. And I guess that's what you were saying before about if there's not time to grieve. Yeah. So,
Yeah, and I agree with that, and it's kind of acknowledging that it's actually okay to not be okay, isn't it?
yeah,
That it's okay to be really angry or
yeah,
sad.
yeah. And so, what would you see as coping? Like, what does coping mean with grieving?
Yeah, I think for me it's that you don't feel quite so haunted by the loss,
Yeah,
that over time you can see that you've really lost an important person in your life, but that you don't have to hide from the loss, and that you're not affected by it so much in a day that it affects your functioning on such a daily basis. And
yeah,
that hopefully you can get to a place where you can talk about the person that died in a healthy way, without being overcome every time, and that they can become part of your life but in a different way.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. And what do you see as the outcomes for parents who get the help they need? What might be kind of different about their grief?
Well, that's a big question, isn't it? I think, yeah, getting the help you need, I think it's usually that you feel like you're managing more, that the day-to-day becomes a little bit easier. And I think when I'm thinking about that, it's also important to acknowledge that I think grief is such a journey that it's okay to have days that are still hard, especially when we lose people that are so important to us, but that overall you begin to get to a place where you feel like you are managing more on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And what do you see, I guess, at this particular time in our lives when we're in the middle of a pandemic? We just had a resurgence yesterday in New South Wales, and that's had an immediate effect on people's lives. What do you see as the effect of COVID on people's grief?
Oh, I think it's been so hard because there's been so much isolation. I think usually there can be a strong community support. We can have rituals. We can come together as families or communities, and it can really you can feel like you've got a lot of support around your grieving, and it can feel like you're not so alone. Whereas I feel like a lot of people that have lost babies and children over the last year for me have really felt so isolated, not nearly as supported as they normally would, and have felt that also so many other people are isolated and not coping, that there hasn't been that support for them.
Yeah, yeah. It's lovely while we're talking about parenting that I can hear your kids in the background. Just a
She's yelling out to me, I'm not quite sure.
nod to children. So I've also got a couple of questions that came from our online group for people bereaved by suicide. And so I'm just going to ask you those questions and see what you can share with us from your practice wisdom. So one of our group members said, I'd love a way to explain death to my sons, as we're not religious. So it'd be really helpful to explain to them where their loved ones have gone. So that's where people don't have, a religious belief that has kind of prescribed answers about heaven.
Yeah.
So what would you say would be helpful then?
Yeah, and I think this can be a really hard thing to do at a time of such acute pain, because you're trying to search for the answers sometimes of what this makes sense to you, and then having to have a story to kind of tell your children and share that with them.
Yeah.
And I think for that reason, religion is sometimes an easy kind of thing to fall back on, because you already have a story that someone has made for you. So it can be really hard, but also really important to kind of think, what will be my family's idea of what happens next? What do I want our family story to be about how I think this happens? So it can be important to really think about what you think happens after people die, and then think about a way of embracing that to share with your children, so they really feel that it's an honest and true reflection of how you feel. I think it's important to find something that resonates with you. So a lot of the families that I work with will say something like, when someone dies, they may not be physically with us, but they always live on in our heart or our memories, and kind of finding something that feels authentic to you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I guess that's the growth that happens with grieving, isn't it? You have to dig deep for some answers for yourself and other people about these really big questions. What happens after death? Yeah, there's nothing bigger than that, I think.
Yeah. And it is, isn't it? And it's so confronting yet so important at the same time.
That's right. Yeah. Okay, so the other question was, I'm curious how to explain to children when somebody died by suicide that that's really personal, and when children really push for details and seem to not understand that it's a painful thing to discuss and it can be inappropriate. And I wonder how children who have lost a parent cope with the natural inquisitiveness of their friends who might be wanting details out of curiosity, wanting a story. Yeah.
And I wonder if I can break them down into two parts, but they kind of both tie together. And I think it's really important when someone dies that it's okay to teach your kids that I'm not quite ready to talk about that. That you could say, oh, the questions that you're asking, I'm going to have to spend some time thinking about that so we can come and talk about that another time. Or that maybe I'm not quite ready to talk about how they died because that's actually something that's really sad for me to talk about right now, but we can have a think about that and talk about it another time. Because once again, teaching children that it's okay not to have to feel about or not to have to talk about everything all the time. Like all of us, we all have times where we don't feel like we actually want to talk about something. So teaching them that it's okay to be sad and upset, but I actually can't talk about everything all of the time with you.
Sure.
Especially suicide, especially in the initial period after it, often there's so much shock and confusion yourself. It takes some time for you to get your head around it yourself before you actually feel ready to be able to talk about that without breaking down.
Yeah.
Which I think then flows into your children and how you talk to them before going back to school or before seeing friends again. It can be helpful to talk to them about what do you want to tell your friends?
Yeah.
What do you feel comfortable in sharing? If someone asks you something you don't want to talk about, what kind of things could you say? So preparing for them for the uncomfortable questions as well and letting your kids know you're actually allowed to tell people you don't want to talk about it if you're not quite ready as well.
Yeah.
So that way, when they go back to school or activities or whatever it is, they actually feel like it's okay. They actually don't have to share if they're not ready.
Yeah. That's great
Yeah.
advice. And it makes me think about the dual process model of grief, where we've got one track that is life and, school and activities and sleeping and eating. And then we've got the other track that is the grieving and the thinking about what happened and missing the person. And they're sort of going on side by side. And that's how to navigate.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, when you said that, it reminded me of the like getting sick at school or needing a break. And sometimes you're going about the daily routine, you're at school, but all of a sudden you have a thought of someone that you've lost. And it's actually okay for you to say, I actually need to go home. I don't feel well today, because we all have to give ourselves space for both of them.
Yeah, sure. And there can be triggers that bring memories up, some days more than other days. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, even at the moment with like kind of like you think of Mother's Day and birthdays and anniversaries, and I think about how many people at different times of the year struggle just because of those days coming up. It can be so hard.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, they're really beautiful thoughts that you've shared with us and some real tips and strategies for parents. Yeah, so thank you so much, Brooke, for sharing your practice wisdom. It's been lovely to talk to you today.
No worries. Thank you so much for having me.